I have Dr. Piet Croukamp, a political analyst, with me in the studio, and today we're going to talk about the Deputy President of South Africa, Paul Mashatile. Welcome to the NSN studio.
Thank you very much.
You wrote an interesting article where you call Paul Mashatile the master patron of a totally corrupt liberation movement. Can we dive into who Paul Mashatile is and why you think he is a nightmare that is actually growing in stature?
Paul Mashatile is, I think, is most well known for what people use or describe as the part of the Alex Mafia, and that used to be a group that operated in Gauteng, specifically in Gauteng, in Alexandra, and their aim was to, in some other way, capture tenders and process the supply chains, to try to occupy the supply chains that feeds into the value chains of state-owned enterprises, and that feeds into government departments at provincial level, but also at municipal level. And since then, I think the News 24, they've written numerous articles which shows how his family became empowered through tenders, and he then feeds off the benefit of those tenders and the access that they have to the supply chains or to the services that being provided by private sector companies en route to black economic empowerment. That services he feeds of them, he benefits from them, and that's more or less the nature of his operations. And I've been at a leadership election when he was elected deputy president, and there was deep divisions within the ANC about his position as the deputy president. He couldn't find traction in KwaZulu-Natal. He battled to make headway in Mpumalanga. And I think he made it as the deputy president but because of the absence of a real candidate. The other candidate was Mkhize, who was released from his position because of corruption. And I think it was just the less worse of the two candidates that actually made it to become the deputy president. So his identity is one that's embedded in the tenderpreneurship, and that he rides the wave of black economic empowerment. Uh, you will notice that more recently, his wife has a twin sister, and the twin sister was a month before a tender, a very lucrative tender to manage the lotto in South Africa. It's a tender of around about 186 billion rand. A month before that tender was finalized by the Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister Parks Tau, suddenly there was a little company formed, and that company included his sister-in-law. And that company then won the tender to manage the lotto for the next couple of years or few years. And he defended that by saying that where must my family do business if they can't do it in South Africa? But the problem is that FATF, the institution that watches over these things and that has grey listed South Africa, and that we would, it's a status that we would like to in some other way put behind us. We're trying desperately to get off the grey list. The Treasury is full-time busy to try to get us off the grey list, but the grey listing, this company says that this type of crime by association or benefit by association is one of the things that they are very, very skeptical of, and that they argue South Africa do not necessarily either prevent it or prosecute it when there are evidence of corruption. So Paul Mashatile is making South Africa's our understanding of how the state should manage its finances and who should have access to it, the impact of black economic empowerment, the real value thereof, all these things become convoluted when you think of the life and times of Paul Mashatile. Most South Africans fear the likeliness of him becoming president. It seems to be more and more likely.
Well, if you look at just like the government communication feed that they have on WhatsApp that all journalists follow, and we get photographs and everything from there, he is so prominent. I mean, he's everywhere. He's in Russia. addresses trade meetings. So if Ramaphosa's camp, you would think, fears him, why does he allow him to have such prominence?
Yeah, he's also met the Chinese president and their premier. It seems like he's busy fermenting new economic relations, and it's right at the time when American President Donald Trump has imposed 30% tariffs on South Africa, and we have, for all practical purposes, been kicked out of AGOA. And it looks like the Mashatile faction within the ANC, who had always been pro-liberation movement and anti-West, they have now found the route to escape the presence of the Western political economies in South Africa. So that they more and more seeks to move back to uh, all those governments and countries that Donald Trump and America uh, raises as the reason why we should be paying 30% tariff and why we should be alienated from the American political economy because we have the wrong friends. We make friends with the enemies of the West, is the argument in Washington. And he is deliberately and visibly doing that. But you will also see that in South Africa, the president has made him the chairperson of a whole range of cabinet committees. It's become a very important part of the cabinet. For some reason, Ramaphosa uh, quite often do not um, uh, take control of the cabinet meetings himself. And Paul Mashatile is doing that. Paul Mashatile is also in charge of the conflict resolution mechanism within the government of national unity. And most of the opposition parties says the reason why there's an absence of consensus and the reason why they are ignored when it comes to foreign policy, economic policy, and other important decisions is because of Paul Mashatile. So it is on both the domestic front as well as the international front. He's risen to a degree of prominence, which is concerning. So the question you have to ask yourself, if it's true that the faction around Ramaphosa is concerned about him, that they didn't vote for him during the leadership election, and that they would prefer another candidate. But you'll remember just about a month ago, MCHUNU, the Minister of Police, was a real contender for the presidency of South Africa and the presidency of the ANC in 2027. And suddenly, because of the charges of corruption of MCHUNU, he's now, I think, he's pretty much erased as a possibility. So, what happened to this faction that opposed Paul Mashatile? As it is, we don't know. We don't know who will they advance as a new candidate, for instance, and whether there will be somebody that they can advance. But there's another concerning thing that happens now. The president himself, in a fear of being removed by Paul Mashatile, because you must remember, Paul Mashatile and the ANC chairperson, Gwedi Mantashe, has become very close. Gwedi Mantashe has now joined the faction of the Paul Mashatile side of the conflict. And the reason why I did so is because the president removed him from the energy side of that portfolio of mining and gave that to José Ramaphosa. That uh, uh, split the loyalty of Gwedi Mantashe, and he jumped ship to the side of Paul Mashatile. So the one big fear that Ramaphosa has is that Gwedi Mantashe, who was the one who knocked on the door of Jacob Zuma to tell him that he's being removed, who was the one who knocked on the door of Thabo Mbeki to tell him that he was being removed, that Paul Mashatile and Gwedi Mantashe might decide to come and knock on his door too and remove him early. That's the one thing he seeks to avoid. And if he has to empower Paul Mashatile to prevent that, he will do so. Because he's in this conundrum. If you empower him, there's a greater likeliness that he will remove you because he's empowered to do that. If you don't empower him, he will come for you in some other opportunistic way and you will still be removed. So I think the president is between a rock and a hard place here. He fears that Mashatile will remove him. And Mashatile, because he thinks that it's unlikely that he will win a leadership election in 2027 at Nasrec, when all the branches come together, he might think that if I can remove Ramaphosa before the end of his term, and it can give me 6 months as the president of South Africa. It gives me a very different platform from which to negotiate and from which to convince the branches and the House to support my candidacy. So yeah, yes, there's a lot of shenanigans and a lot of things happening just beneath the surface.
So, what would a South Africa look like under the leadership or a president as Paul Mashatile? Because it seems he would take it definitely South Africa further away from the West, because he's constantly, with China and Russia.
Yeah, he's not a state capturer in the sense that Jacob Zuma was, but he's a tenderpreneur. And the tenders and black economic empowerment are the entry points of corruption into the value and supply chains of the South African economy, the private sector, the state sector, as well as the state-owned enterprises. So one have to suspect, since he seems to be so reckless about it and so upfront about it, that that's his preference, his way of doing business, and the way he thinks about it. You have to assume that it'll be impossible to curb corruption in the future, and that it might even proliferate much further. And we are already in a dire situation because of corruption, and the absence of trust in our economy is increasingly tied to the fact that nobody trusts our state institutions to provide services, to manage their affairs prudently. It's a big battle in South Africa. That's one of the reasons why democratic rights are curbed in South Africa. It's because the institutions that have to provide those services, from ESCOM to local government, uh, they are captured by corrupt entrepreneurs with links to people like Paul Mashatile and other important government officials. If you don't want to believe me, believe General Makwenazi, who alluded to that exactly. It comes from crime to drug smuggling to gun running, right up to cabinet level is his accusation. It goes right from local government level, right through the system to the top. And Paul Mashatile, he sees nothing wrong with that. That's the type of state that that he's grown up in. The liberation movement of his past has reflected that type of behavior and characteristics. He's very much used to it. And people find the South Africa saturated with cadres, saturated with cartels, organized crime syndicates who will encourage him and will be active participating in that way of thinking about how to distribute the resources of the South African economy.
So the police is very politicized, as you can see. So can we expect it to be increasingly so?
It's not only the police. 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, Shamila Batoy said that there are many people within the National Prosecuting Authority that don't have the interest of justice at heart. We know that this type of phenomenon, where organized crime move into the space, into the jurisdiction of the state, it filters right through the state, right through different levels of government, into the different spheres of government. Mkonazi says so many people sit in parliament. It's actually true. Some of them are members of the MK party, but there are many of them still members of the ANC. And many of them sit in the provincial executive committees of the ANC, and they have direct control over the tenders and the service provision at local government level, in provincial government level. I don't want to exaggerate this and make it sound as if there's nothing left that works. It's just that the destructive forces, the destructive variables in the equation is of such a nature that you can tick over, you can exist, but you cannot grow. You cannot address the 40% unemployment. You cannot address the fact that 70% of schools are dysfunctional. We cannot do. We have around about 75% to GDP debt now. If you add local government, the provincial government, it goes up to 90%. We cannot pay the debt back ever. It's not possible. Our economy is not productive enough to do that. You will reach the point where it will put enormous pressure on the value of our currency, on the rand. Once you have that type of pressure, you get increased inflation. And the only way to respond to increased inflation is rising interest rates. And once you end up in that spiral, and quite frankly, economists tell me we can't be too far away from that. Once you end up in that spiral, that's when people with money leave as quickly as possible. So they drain the system even further. That's when expertise start to leave. And the signs of money leaving South Africa is already there, and the signs of experts already leaving is also there. So we're heading in the wrong direction, man. We're heading in the wrong direction, and Paul Mashatile is the last thing we can afford. Since we have to turn the ship around. We had high hopes when RAMAPHOSA became president, that he had the inkling, the willingness to change the ship around. And in his very first speech, he actually said it as much, that this has to be turned around. We are we are guilty of ruining South Africans' future. We must turn this around, was what he said by implication. And then he did nothing. Nothing. In fact, each and every economic statistic is now worse than it was under Jacob Zuma. And at the time, we thought it's not possible for it to get worse, but it was.
And there doesn't seem to be a deal coming, and we're so close to that.
It's the
Yeah.
1st of August. Yeah.
Yep.
It seems like the Americans don't know about South Africans talking about a deal. It's almost the same that Donald Trump keep on saying that he's talking to all sorts of countries about deals, and then nobody can find the evidence. Well, Ramaphosa is also suggesting that we are talking to the Americans, but nobody can figure out who exactly is doing the talking. And on the other side, like the Chinese denying they're talking to the Americans deny that they talk to the South Africans. Somebody's not very honest, yeah. But the fact of the matter is, we're not going to change anything before the 1st of August. But having said that, I don't think it is possible to change Donald Trump's mind about South Africa in any case. If you look at Canada and Europe and a whole range of other countries throughout the world who really tried much harder, much better positioned than we are, much less offensive to America than we are, and they couldn't get the deals, the tariffs lowered, except, of course, Swaziland, just here, who is quite willing to take hundreds of criminals from the Americans off their hands. They have a 10% tariff. So I think that's what you have to do. We thought tariffs will be an economic deal. It seems like it must be a political deal.
And what about them? There's also impending sanctions from the US on ANC leaders.
Yeah, there's the likeliness that they're still discussing it in committee phases. There has to be accepted and voted on by the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. So it could be a long time before that becomes a reality. But it is quite possible. But what that will do is it will just drive the ANC, and they will find all the motivation they need to say, well, we're leaving America, we're leaving the Western political economies, and we now have only interest with China and the other opportunistic economies like Iran and Venezuela. It's not a good thing for South Africa if the ANC is battered by American interests now, because they will turn on us. We will end up in the middle between right-wing people that leave South Africa and go and convince the Americans that they need to install sanctions on America on ANC leaders. We're trapped between Donald Trump and the right wing, and there is no escape. We're trapped between the ANC and the right wing in South Africa. The ANC is deliberately ruining South Africa. The right wing or the conservative groups, they rightfully complain about it. But the strategy that the strategy that they use to resolve the issue is going to hurt us all. There's no escape. The ANC will do the one thing that we can't afford, and they will just suspend their relations with the West. And eventually, we all know, if you are friends with dictators and authoritarian states, it's not long before you see the signs and the likeliness that you yourself can deal in that way with your society. Just remember, South Africa is a massively disempowered society. People are unemployed, have no work, uneducated. It's a very disempowered society. If the liberal democratic ideals of 1994 and 1996 are being challenged, few people can come to its defense.
Yeah. Dr. Piet Croukamp, thanks so much. Thanks,
Thank
Piet.
you very much.